This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sky Island by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 21. The Capture of Cap'n Bill. While this was transpiring in the palace, Cap'n Bill and the Pinkies had encamped before the principal gate of the city, and a tent had been pitched for Trot and Button-Bright and Rosalie. The army had been very fearful and weak-kneed when it first entered the Blue Country, but perceiving that the Boorloo and his people were afraid of them and had locked themselves up in the city, the Pinkies grew bolder and longed to make an attack. One of them, in his curiosity to examine the Blue City, got a little too near the wall, and a blue soldier threw his cord and weight at him. The cord didn't wind around the Pinky, as he was too far off, but the weight hit him in the eye and made him howl lustily as he trotted back to his comrades at full speed. After this experience, the invaders were careful to keep a safe distance from the wall. The Bolaroo, having made all preparations to receive the enemy, was annoyed because they held back. He was himself so nervous and excited that he became desperate, and after an hour of tedious waiting, during which time he pranced around impatiently, he decided to attack the hated Pinkies and rid the country of them. "Their dreadful color makes me hysterical," he said to his soldiers. "So if I am to have any peace of mind, we must charge the foe and drive them back into the Fog Bank. But take all the prisoners you can, my brave men, and tomorrow we will have a jolly time patching them. Don't be afraid; those pink creatures have no blue blood in their veins, and they'll run like rabbits when they see us coming." Then he ordered the gate thrown open, and immediately the Blueskins poured out into the open plain and began to run toward the Pinkies. The Boorloo went out too, but he kept well behind his people, remembering the sharp sticks with which the enemy were armed. Cap'n Bill was alert and had told his army what to do in case of an attack. The Pinkies did not run like rabbits, but formed a solid line and knelt down with their long, sharp sticks pointed directly towards the Blueskins, the other ends being set firmly upon the ground. Of course, the Blueskins couldn't run against these sharp points, so they halted a few feet away and began to swing their cord and weights. But the Pinkies were too close together to be caught in this manner, and now by command of Cap'n Bill they suddenly rose to their feet and began jabbing their sticks at the foe. The Blueskins hesitated until a few got pricked and began to yell with terror, when the whole of the Booloroo's attacking party turned and ran back to the gate, their ruler reaching it first of all. The Pinkies tried to chase them, but their round, fat legs were no match for the long, thin legs of the Blueskins, who quickly gained the gate and shut themselves up in the city again. "It is evident," panted the Boorloo, facing his defeated soldiers wrathfully, "that you are a pack of cowards." "We but followed your own royal example in running," replied the Captain. "I merely ran back to the city to get a drink of water, for I was thirsty," declared the Boorloo. "So did we! So did we!" cried the soldiers eagerly. "We were all thirsty." "Your high and mighty, spry and flighty Majesty," remarked the Captain respectfully, "it occurs to me that the weapons of the Pinkies are superior to our own. What we need, in order to oppose them successfully, is a number of sharp sticks, which are longer than their own." "True, true!" exclaimed the Boorloo enthusiastically. "Get to work at once and make yourselves long, sharp sticks, and then we will attack the enemy again." So the soldiers and citizens all set to work preparing long, sharp sticks, and while they were doing this Rosalie the Witch had a vision in which she saw exactly what was going on inside the city wall. Queen Trot and Cap'n Bill and Button-Bright saw the vision too, for they were all in the tent together, and the sight made them anxious. "What can be done?" asked the girl. "The Blueskins are bigger and stronger than the Pinkies, and if they have sharp sticks which are longer than ours, they will surely defeat us." "I have one magic charm," said Rosalie thoughtfully, "that will save our army, but I am allowed to work only one magic charm every 3 days, not oftener, and perhaps I'll need the magic for other things." "Strikes me, ma'am," returned the sailor, "that what we need most on this expedition is to capture the Blueskins. If we don't, we'll need plenty of magic to help us back to the Pink Country; but if we do, we can take care of ourselves without magic." "Very well," replied Rosalie. "I will take your advice, Cap'n, and enchant the weapons of the Pinkies." She then went out and had all the Pinkies come before her one by one, and she enchanted their sharp sticks by muttering some cabalistic words and making queer passes with her hands over the weapons. "Now," she said to them, "you will be powerful enough to defeat the Blueskins, whatever they may do." The Pinkies were overjoyed at this promise, and it made them very brave indeed, since they now believed they would surely be victorious. When the Boolooroo's people were armed with the long, thin lances of blue wood, all sharpened to fine points at one end, they prepared to march once more against the invaders. Their sticks were twice as long as those of the Pinkies, and the Boolooroo chuckled with glee to think what fun they would have in punching holes in the round, fat bodies of his enemies. Out from the gate they marched very boldly and pressed on to attack the Pinkies, who were drawn up in line of battle to receive them, with Cap'n Bill at their head. When the opposing forces came together, however, and the Blueskins pushed their points against the Pinkies, the weapons which had been enchanted by Rosalie began to whirl in swift circles, so swift that the eye could scarcely follow the motion. The result was that the lances of the Booloroo's people could not touch the Pinkies, but were thrust aside with violence and either broken in two or sent hurtling through the air in all directions. Finding themselves so suddenly disarmed, the amazed Blueskins turned about and ran again, while Cap'n Bill, greatly excited by his victory, shouted to his followers to pursue the enemy, and hobbled after them as fast as he could make his wooden leg go, swinging his sharp stick as he advanced. The Blues were in such a frightened, confused mass that they got in one another's way and could not make very good progress on the retreat. So the old sailor soon caught up with them and began jabbing at the crowd with his stick. Unfortunately, the Pinkies had not followed their commander, being for the moment dazed by their success, so that Cap'n Bill was all alone among the Blueskins when he stepped his wooden leg into a hole in the ground and tumbled full length, his sharp stick flying from his hand and pricking the Bolaroo in the leg as it fell. At this the ruler of the Blues stopped short in his flight to yell with terror, but seeing that only the sailorman was pursuing them, and that this solitary foe had tumbled flat upon the ground, he issued a command, and several of his people fell upon poor Cap'n Bill, seized him in their long arms, and carried him struggling into the city, where he was fast bound. Then a panic fell upon the Pinkies at the loss of their leader, and Trot and Button-Bright called out in vain for them to rescue Cap'n Bill. By the time the army recovered their wits and prepared to obey, it was too late, and although Trot ran with them in her eagerness to save her friend, the gate was found to be fast barred, and she knew it was impossible for them to force an entrance into the city. So she went sorrowfully back to the camp, followed by the Pinkies, and asked Rosalie what could be done. "I'm sure I do not know," replied the witch. "I cannot use another magic charm until 3 days have expired. But if they do not harm Cap'n Bill during that time, I believe I can then find a way to save him." "3 days is a long time," remarked Trot dismally. "The Bolaroo may decide to patch him at once," added Button-Bright, with equal sadness, for he too mourned the sailor's loss. "It can't be helped," replied Rosalie. "I am not a fairy, my dears, but merely a witch, and so my magic powers are limited. We can only hope that the Bolaroo won't patch Cap'n Bill for 3 days." When night settled down upon the camp of the Pinkies, where many tents had now been pitched, all the invaders were filled with gloom. The band tried to enliven them by playing the Dead March, but it was not a success. The Pinkies were despondent in spite of the fact that they had repulsed the attack of the Blues, for as yet they had not succeeded in gaining the city or finding the Magic Umbrella, and the blue dusk of this dread country, which was so different from their own land of sunsets, made them all very nervous. They saw the moon rise for the first time in their lives, and its cold, silvery radiance made them shudder and prevented them from going to sleep. Trot tried to interest them by telling them that on the earth the people had both the sun and the moon and loved them both. But nevertheless, it is certain that had not the terrible fog bank stood between them and the pink land, most of the invading army would have promptly deserted and gone back home. Trot couldn't sleep either, she was so worried over Cap'n Bill. She went back to the tent where Rosalie and Button-Bright were sitting in the moonlight and asked the witch if there was no way in which she could secretly get into the City of the Blues and search for her friend. Rosalie thought it over for some time and then replied, "We can make a rope ladder that will enable you to climb to the top of the wall, and then you can lower it to the other side and descend into the city. But if anyone should see you, you would be captured." "I'll risk that," said the child, excited at the prospect of gaining the side of Cap'n Bill in this adventurous way. "Please make the rope ladder at once, Rosalie." So the witch took some ropes and knotted together a ladder long enough to reach to the top of the wall. When it was finished, the three, Rosalie, Trot, and Button-Bright, stole out into the moonlight and crept unobserved into the shadow of the wall. The Blueskins were not keeping a very close watch, as they were confident the Pinkies could not get into the city. The hardest part of Rosalie's task was to toss up one end of the rope ladder until it would catch on some projection on top of the wall. There were few such projections, but after creeping along the wall for a distance they saw the end of a broken flagstaff near the top edge. The witch tossed up the ladder, trying to catch it upon this point, and on the seventh attempt she succeeded. "Good!" cried Trot. "Now I can climb up." "Don't you want me to go with you?" asked Button-Bright, a little wistfully. "No," said the girl. "You must stay to lead the army. And if you can think of a way, you must try to rescue us. Perhaps I'll be able to save Cap'n Bill myself, but if I don't, it's all up to you, Button-Bright." "I'll do my best," he promised. "And here, keep my Polly till I come back," added Trot, giving him the bird. "I can't take it with me, for it would be a bother, and if it tried to spout poetry, I'd be discovered in a jiffy." As the beautiful witch kissed the little girl goodbye, she slipped upon her finger a curious ring. At once Button-Bright exclaimed, "Why, where has she gone?" "I'm right here," said Trot's voice by his side. "Can't you see me?" "No," replied the boy, mystified. Rosalie laughed. "It's a magic ring I've loaned you, my dear," said she, "and as long as you wear it you will be invisible to all eyes, those of Blueskins and Pinkies alike. I'm going to let you wear this wonderful ring, for it will save you from being discovered by your enemies. If at any time you wish to be seen, take the ring from your finger, but as long as you wear it no one can see you, not even earth people." "Oh, thank you!" cried Trot. "That will be fine." "I see you have another ring on your hand," said Rosalie, "and I perceive it is enchanted in some way. Where did you get it?" "The Queen of the Mermaids gave it to me," answered Trot. "But Sky Island is so far away from the sea that the ring won't do me any good while I'm here. It's only to call the mermaids to me if I need them, and they can't swim in the sky, you see." Rosalie smiled and kissed her again. "Be brave, my dear," she said, "and I am sure you will be able to find Cap'n Bill without getting in danger yourself. But be careful not to let any Blueskin touch you, for while you are in contact with any person you will become visible. Keep out of their way and you will be perfectly safe. Don't lose the ring, for you must give it back to me when you return. It is one of my witchcraft treasures, and I need it in my business." Then Trot climbed the ladder, although neither Button-Bright nor Rosalie could see her do so, and when she was on top the broad wall she pulled up the knotted ropes and began to search for a place to let it down on the other side. A little way off she found a bluestone seat near to the inner edge, and attaching the ladder to this she easily descended it and found herself in the Blue City. A guard was pacing up and down near her, but as he could not see the girl, he of course paid no attention to her. So after marking the place where the ladder hung, that she might know how to reach it again, Trot hurried away through the streets of the city. End of chapter 21. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sky Island by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 22. Trot's Invisible Adventure. All the Blueskins, except a few sentries, had gone to bed and were sound asleep. A blue gloom hung over the city, which was scarcely relieved by a few bluish wavering lights here and there. But Trot knew the general direction in which the palace lay, and she decided to go there first. She believed the Bolaroo would surely keep so important a prisoner as Cap'n Bill locked up in his own palace. Once or twice the little girl lost her way, for the streets were very puzzling to one not accustomed to them. But finally she sighted the great palace and went up to the entrance. There she found a double guard posted. They were sitting on a bench outside the doorway, and both stood up as she approached. "We thought we heard footsteps," said one. "So did we," replied the other, "yet there is no one in sight." Trot then saw that the guards were the two patched men, Jim Fred Jones Jinks and Fred Jim Jinks Jones, who had been talking together quite cheerfully. It was the first time the girl had seen them together, and she marveled at the queer patching that had so strongly united them, yet so thoroughly separated them. "You see," remarked Jim Fred, as they seated themselves again upon the bench, "the Bolaroo has ordered the patching to take place tomorrow after breakfast. The old Earth man is to be patched to poor Tiggle instead of Ghip Ghisizzle, who has in some way managed to escape from the room of the Great Knife. No one knows how but Tiggle, and Tiggle won't tell." "We're sorry for anyone who has to be patched," remarked Fred Jim in a reflective tone, "for although it didn't hurt us as much as we expected, it's a terrible mix-up to be in until we became used to our strange combination. You and we are about alike now, Jim Fred, although we were so different before." "Not so," said Jim Fred. "We are really more intelligent than you are, for the left side of our brain was always the keenest before we were patched." "That may be," admitted Fred Jim, "but we are much the strongest because our right arm was by far the best before we were patched." "We are not sure of that," responded Jim Fred, "for we have a right arm, too, and it is pretty strong." "We will test it," suggested the other, "by all pulling upon one end of this bench with our right arms. Whichever can pull the bench from the others must be the stronger." While they were tussling at the bench, dragging it first here and then there in the trial of strength, Trot opened the door of the palace and walked in. It was pretty dark in the hall, and only a few dim blue lights showed at intervals down the long corridors. As the girl walked through these passages, she could hear snores of various degrees coming from behind some of the closed doors, and knew that all the regular inmates of the place were sound asleep. So she mounted to the upper floor, and thinking she would be likely to find Cap'n Bill in the room of the Great Knife, she went there and tried the door. It was locked, but the key had been left on the outside. She waited until the sentry who was pacing the corridor had his back toward her, and then she turned the key and slipped within, softly closing the door behind her. It was dark as pitch in the room, and Trot didn't know how to make a light. After a moment's thought, she began feeling her way to the window, stumbling over objects as she went. Every time she made a noise, someone groaned, and that made the child uneasy. At last she found a window and managed to open the shutters and let the moonlight in. It wasn't a very strong moonlight, but it enabled her to examine the interior of the room. In the center stood the great knife which the Bolaroo used to split people in two when he patched them, and at one side was a dark form huddled upon the floor and securely bound. Trot hastened to this form and knelt beside it, but was disappointed to find it was only Tiggle. The man stirred a little and rolled against Trot's knee, when she at once became visible to him. "Oh, it's the Earth Child," said he. "Are you condemned to be patched too, little one?" "No," answered Trot. "Tell me where Cap'n Bill is." "I can't," said Tiggle. The Bolaroo has hidden him until tomorrow morning, when he's to be patched to me. Ghip Ghisizzle was to have been my mate, but Ghip escaped, being carried away by the 6 snub-nosed princesses." "Why?" she asked. "One of them means to marry him," explained Tiggle. "Oh, that's worse than being patched!" cried Trot. "Much worse," said Tiggle with a groan. But now an idea occurred to the girl. "Would you like to escape?" she asked the captive. "I would, indeed," said he. "If I get you out of the palace, can you hide yourself so that you won't be found?" "Certainly," he declared. "I know a house where I can hide so snugly that all the Boolooroo's soldiers cannot find me." "All right," said Trot. "I'll do it, for when you're gone the Boolooroo will have no one to patch Cap'n Bill to." "He may find someone else," suggested the prisoner. "But it will take him time to do that, and time is all I want," answered the child. Even while she spoke, Trot was busy with the knots in the cords, and presently she had unbound Tiggle, who soon got upon his feet. "Now I'll go to one end of the passage and make a noise," said she, "and when the guard runs to see what it is, you must run the other way. Outside the palace Jim Fred and Fred Jim are on guard, but if you tip over the bench they are seated on, you can easily escape them." "I'll do that, all right," promised the delighted Tiggle. "You've made a friend of me, little girl, and if ever I can help you, I'll do it with pleasure." Then Trot started for the door, and Tiggle could no longer see her because she was not now touching him. The man was much surprised at her disappearance, but listened carefully, and when he heard the girl make a noise at one end of the corridor, he opened the door and ran in the opposite direction as he had been told to do. Of course the guard could not discover what made the noise, and Trot ran little risk, as she was careful not to let him touch her. When Tiggle had safely escaped, the little girl wandered through the palace in search of Cap'n Bill, but soon decided such a quest in the dark was likely to fail, and she must wait until morning. She was tired, too, and thought she would find a vacant room, of which there were many in the big palace, and go to sleep until daylight. She remembered there was a comfortable vacant room just opposite the suite of the 6 snub-nosed princesses, so she stole softly up to it and tried the door. It was locked, but the key was outside, as the Blueskins seldom took a door key away from its place. So she turned the key, opened the door, and walked in. Now this was the chamber in which Ghip Ghisizzle had been confined by the princesses, his arms being bound tight to his body but his legs left free. The Bolaroo, in his search, had failed to discover what had become of Ghip Ghisizzle, but the poor man had been worried every minute for fear his retreat would be discovered, or that the terrible princesses would come for him and nag him until he went crazy. There was one window in his room, and the prisoner had managed to push open the sash with his knees. Looking out, he found that a few feet below the window was the broad wall that ran all around the palace gardens. A little way to the right the wall joined the wall of the city, being on the same level with it. Ghip Ghisizzle had been thinking deeply upon this discovery, and he decided that if anyone entered his room he would get through the window, leap down upon the wall, and try in this way to escape. It would be a dangerous leap, for as his arms were bound he might topple off the wall into the garden, but he resolved to take this chance. Therefore, when Trot rattled at the door of his room, Ghip Ghisizzle ran and seated himself upon the window sill, dangling his long legs over the edge. When she finally opened the door, he slipped off and let himself fall to the wall, where he doubled up in a heap. The next minute, however, he had scrambled to his feet and was running swiftly along the garden wall. Trot, finding the window open, came and looked out, and she saw the majordomo's tall form hastening along the top of the wall. The guards saw him too, outlined against the sky in the moonlight, and they began yelling at him to stop. But Ghip Ghisizzle kept right on until he reached the city wall, when he began to follow that. More guards were yelling now, running along the foot of the wall to keep the fugitive in sight, and people began to pour out of the houses and join in the chase. Poor Ghip realized that if he kept on the wall, he would merely circle the city and finally be caught. If he leaped down into the city, he would be seized at once. Just then he came opposite the camp of the Pinkies, and decided to trust himself to the mercies of his earth friends rather than be made a prisoner by his own people, who would obey the commands of their detested but greatly feared Boorloo. So suddenly he gave a mighty leap and came down into the field outside the city. Again he fell in a heap and rolled over and over, for it was a high wall and the jump a dangerous one. But finally he recovered and got upon his feet, delighted to find he had broken none of his bones. Some of the Blueskins had by now opened a gate, and out rushed a crowd to capture the fugitive, but Ghip Ghisizzle made straight for the camp of the Pinkies, and his pursuers did not dare follow him far in that direction. They soon gave up the chase and returned to the city, while the runaway Majordomo was captured by Captain Coralie and marched away to the tent of Rosalie the Witch, a prisoner of the Pinkies. End of chapter 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sky Island by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 23. The Girl and the Boorloo. Trot watched from the window the escape of Ghip Ghisizzle, but did not know, of course, who it was. Then, after the city had quieted down again, she lay upon the bed without undressing and was sound asleep in a minute. The blue dawn was just breaking when she opened her eyes with a start of fear that she might have overslept, but soon she found that no one else in the palace was yet astir. Even the guards had gone to sleep by this time and were adding their snores to the snores of the other inhabitants of the royal palace. So the little girl got up and, finding an ewer of water and a basin upon the dresser, washed herself carefully and then looked in a big mirror to see how her hair was. To her astonishment there was no reflection at all. The mirror was blank, so far as Trot was concerned. She laughed a little at that, remembering she wore the ring of Rosalie the Witch, which rendered her invisible. Then she slipped quietly out of the room and found it was already light enough in the corridors for her to see all objects distinctly. After hesitating a moment which way to turn, she decided to visit the Snub-Nosed Princesses and passed through the big reception room to the sleeping room of Indigo. There this princess, the crossest and most disagreeable of all the Disagreeable Six, was curled up in bed and slumbering cozily. The little blue dog came trotting out of Indigo's boudoir and crowed like a rooster, for although he could not see Trot, his keen little nose scented her presence. Thinking it time the princess awoke, Trot leaned over and gave her snub nose a good tweak, and at once Indigo yelled like an Indian and sat up, glaring around her to see who had dared to pull her nose. Trot, standing back in the room, threw a soft pillow that caught the princess on the side of her head. At once Indigo sprang out of bed and rushed into the chamber of Cobalt, which adjoined her own. Thinking it was this sister who had slyly attacked her, Indigo rushed at the sleeping Cobalt and slapped her face. At once there was war. The other four princesses, hearing the screams and cries of rage, came running into Cobalt's room, and as fast as they appeared, Trot threw pillows at them, so that presently all six were indulging in a free-for-all battle and snarling like tigers. The blue lamb came trotting into the room, and Trot leaned over and patted the pretty little animal, but as she did so she became visible for an instant, each pat destroying the charm of the ring while the girl was in contact with a living creature. These flashes permitted some of the princesses to see her, and at once they rushed toward her with furious cries. But the girl realized what had happened, and leaving the lamb, she stepped back into a corner, and her frenzied enemies failed to find her. It was a little dangerous, though, remaining in a room where six girls were feeling all around for her, so she went away and left them to their vain search while she renewed her hunt for Cap'n Bill. The sailorman did not seem to be in any of the rooms she entered, so she decided to visit the Boolooroo's own apartments. In the room where Rosalie's vision had shown them the Magic Umbrella lying under a cabinet, Trot attempted to find it, for she considered that next to rescuing Cap'n Bill that this was the most important task to accomplish. But the umbrella had been taken away and was no longer beneath the cabinet. This was a severe disappointment to the child, but she reflected that the umbrella was surely some place in the Blue City, so there was no need to despair. Finally she entered the King's own sleeping chamber and found the Bolaroo in bed and asleep, with a funny nightcap tied over his egg-shaped head. As Trot looked at him, she was surprised to see that he had one foot out of bed, and that to his big toe was tied a cord that led out of the bedchamber into a small dressing room beyond. Trot slowly followed this cord, and in the dressing room came upon Cap'n Bill, who was lying asleep upon a lounge and snoring with great vigor. His arms were tied to his body, and his body was tied fast to the lounge. The wooden leg stuck out into the room at an angle, and the shoe on his one foot had been removed, so that the end of the cord could be fastened to the sailor's big toe. This arrangement had been a clever thought of the Bolaroo. Fearing his important prisoner might escape before he was patched, as Ghip Ghisizzle had done, the cruel King of the Blues had kept Cap'n Bill in his private apartments and had tied his own big toe to the prisoner's big toe, so that if the sailor made any attempt to get away, he would pull on the cord, and that would arouse the Bolaroo. Trot saw through this cunning scheme at once, so the first thing she did was to untie the cord from Cap'n Bill's big toe and retie it to a leg of the lounge. Then she unfastened her friend's bonds and leaned over to give his leathery face a smacking kiss. Cap'n Bill sat up and rubbed his eyes. He looked around the room and rubbed his eyes again, seeing no one who could have kissed him. Then he discovered that his bonds had been removed, and he rubbed his eyes once more to make sure he was not dreaming. The little girl laughed softly. "Trot!" exclaimed the sailor, recognizing her voice. Then Trot came up and took his hand, the touch at once rendering her visible to him. "Dear me!" said the bewildered sailor. "However did you get here, mate, in the Boolooroo's own den? Is the Blue City captured?" "Not yet," she replied. "But you are, Cap'n, and I've come to save you." "All alone, Trot?" "All alone, Cap'n Bill. But it's got to be done just the same." And then she explained about the magic ring Rosalie had lent her, which rendered her invisible while she wore it, unless she touched some living creature. Cap'n Bill was much interested. "I'm willin' to be saved, mate," he said, "for the Boolooroo is set on patchin' me right after breakfast, which I hope the cook'll be late with." "Who are you to be patched with?" she asked. "A feller named Tiggle, who's in disgrace 'cause he mixed the royal necktie for me." "That was nectar, not necktie," corrected Trot. "But you needn't be 'fraid of being patched with Tiggle, 'cause I've set him loose. By this time he's in hiding where he can't be found." "That's good," said Cap'n Bill, nodding approval. "But the blamed ol' Bool'roo's sure to find someone else. What's to be done, mate?" Trot thought about it for a moment. Then she remembered how some unknown man had escaped from the palace the night before by means of the wall, which he had reached from the window of the very chamber in which she had slept. Cap'n Bill might easily do the same, and the rope ladder she had used would help the sailor down from the top of the wall. "Could you climb down a rope ladder, Cap'n?" she asked. "Like enough," said he. "I've done it many a time on shipboard." "But you hadn't a wooden leg, then," she reminded him. "The wooden leg won't bother much," he assured her. So Trot tied a small sofa cushion around the end of his wooden leg, so it wouldn't make any noise pounding upon the floor, and then she quietly led the sailor through the room of the sleeping Boolooroo and through several other rooms until they came to the passage. Here a soldier was on guard, but he had fallen asleep for a moment in order to rest himself. They passed this Blueskin without disturbing him and soon reached the chamber opposite the suite of the 6 snub-nosed princesses, whom they could hear still quarreling loudly among themselves. Trot locked the door from the inside so no one could disturb them, and then led the sailor to the window. The garden was just below. "But "Good gracious me! It's a drop o' 10 feet, Trot!" he exclaimed. "And you've only 1 foot to drop, Cap'n," she said, laughing. "Couldn't you let yourself down with one of the sheets from the bed?" "I'll try," he rejoined. "But can you do that circus act, Trot?" "Oh, I'm goin' to stay here and find the Magic Umbrella," she replied. "Being invisible, Cap'n, I'm safe enough. What I want to do is to see you safe back with the Pinkies, and then I'll manage to hold my own all right, never fear." So they brought a blue sheet and tied one end to a post of the blue bed and let the other end dangle out the blue window. "Good bye, mate," said Cap'n Bill, preparing to descend. "Don't get reckless." "I won't, Cap'n. Don't worry." Then he grasped the sheet with both hands and easily let himself down to the wall. Trot had told him where to find the rope ladder she had left and how to fasten it to the broken flagstaff so he could climb down into the field outside the city. As soon as he was safe on the wall, Cap'n Bill began to hobble along the broad top toward the connecting wall that surrounded the entire city, just as Ghip Ghisizzle had done, and Trot anxiously watched him from the window. But the Blue City was now beginning to waken to life. One of the soldiers came from a house, sleepily yawning and stretching himself, and presently his eyes lit upon the huge form of Cap'n Bill hastening along the top of the wall. The soldier gave a yell that aroused a score of his comrades and brought them tumbling into the street. When they saw how the Boolooroo's precious prisoner was escaping, they instantly became alert and wide awake, and every one started in pursuit along the foot of the wall. Of course, the long-legged Blueskins could run faster than poor Cap'n Bill. Some of them soon got ahead of the old sailorman and came to the rope ladder which Trot had left dangling from the stone bench, where it hung down inside the city. The blue soldiers promptly mounted this ladder and so gained the wall, heading off the fugitive. When Cap'n Bill came up, panting and all out of breath, the Blueskins seized him and held him fast. Cap'n Bill was terribly disappointed at being recaptured, and so was Trot, who had eagerly followed his every movement from her window in the palace. The little girl could have cried with vexation, and I think she did weep a few tears before she recovered her courage. But Cap'n Bill was a philosopher, in his way, and had learned to accept ill fortune cheerfully. Knowing he was helpless, he made no protest when they again bound him and carried him down the ladder like a bale of goods. Others were also disappointed by his capture. Button-Bright had heard the parrot squawking, "Oh, there's Cap'n Bill! There's Cap'n Bill! I see him still up on that hill! It's Cap'n Bill!" So the boy ran out of his tent to find the sailor hurrying along the top of the wall as fast as he could go. At once Button-Bright aroused Coralie, who got her Pinkies together and quickly marched them toward the wall to assist in the escape of her commander-in-chief. But they were too late. Before they could reach the wall, the Blueskins had captured Trot's old friend and lugged him down into the city, so Coralie and Button-Bright were forced to return to their camp discomfited. There Ghip Ghisizzle and Rosalie were awaiting them, and all went into the witch's tent and held a council of war. "Tell me," said Ghip Ghisizzle to Button-Bright, "did you not take the Royal Record Book from the treasure chamber of the Bolaroo?" "I did," replied the boy. "I remember that you wanted it, and so I have kept it with me ever since that night. Here it is." And he presented the little blue book to the Majordomo, the only friend the adventurers had found among all the Blueskins. Ghip Ghisizzle took the book eagerly and at once began turning over its leaves. "Ah!" he exclaimed presently, "it is just as I suspected. The wicked Booroo had already reigned over the Blue Country 300 years last Thursday, so that now he has no right to rule at all. I myself have been the rightful ruler of the Blues since Thursday, and yet this cruel and deceitful man has not only deprived me of my right to succeed him, but he has tried to have me patched so that I could never become the Booroo." "Does the book tell how old he is?" asked Button-Bright. "Yes, he is now 500 years old, and has yet another 100 years to live. He planned to rule the Blue Country until the last, but I now know the deception he has practiced, and have the Royal Record Book to prove it. With this I shall be able to force him to resign, that I may take his place, for all the people will support me and abide by the law. The tyrant will perhaps fight me and my cause desperately, but I am sure to win in the end." "If we can help you," said Button Bright, "the whole pink army will fight for you. Only, if you win, you must promise to give me back my Magic Umbrella and let us fly away to our own homes again." "I will do that most willingly," agreed Ghip Ghisizzle. "And now let us consult together how best to take the Blue City and capture the Boorloo. As I know my own country much better than you or the Pinkies do, I think I can find a way to accomplish our purpose." End of chapter 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sky Island by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 24. The Amazing Conquest of the Blues. The shouting and excitement in the city following upon the recapture of Cap'n Bill aroused the sleeping Bolaroo. He found the cord still tied to his big toe, and at first imagined his prisoner was safe in the dressing room. When he put on his clothes, the king occasionally gave the cord a sudden pull, hoping to hurt Cap'n Bill's big toe and make him yell. But as no response came to this mean action, the Bolaroo finally looked into the room, only to find he had been pulling on a leg of the couch and that his prisoner had escaped. Then he flew into a mighty rage, and running out into the hall he aimed a blow at the unfaithful guard, knocking the fellow off his feet. Then he rushed downstairs into the courtyard, shouting loudly for his soldiers and threatening to patch everybody in his dominions if the sailorman was not recaptured. While the Boorloo stormed and raged, a band of soldiers and citizens came marching in, surrounding Cap'n Bill, who was again firmly bound. "So ho!" roared the monarch. "You thought you could defy me, earth clod, did you? But you were mistaken. No one can resist the mighty Boorloo of the Blues, so it is folly for you to rebel against my commands. Hold him fast, my men, and as soon as I've had my coffee and oatmeal, I'll take him to the room of the Great Knife and patch him." "I wouldn't mind a cup o' coffee myself," said Cap'n Bill. "I've had considerable exercise this mornin', and I'm all ready for my breakfast." "Very well," replied the Boorloo. "You shall eat with me, for then I can keep an eye on you. My guards are not to be trusted, and I don't mean to let you out of my sight again until you are patched." So Cap'n Bill and the Boorloo had breakfast together, 6 Blueskins standing in a row back of the sailorman to grab him if he attempted to escape. But Cap'n Bill made no such attempt, knowing it would be useless. Trot was in the room, too, standing in a corner and listening to all that was said, while she racked her little brain for an idea that would enable her to save Cap'n Bill from being patched. No one could see her, so no one, not even Cap'n Bill, knew she was there. After breakfast was over, a procession was formed, headed by the Boorloo, and they marched the prisoner through the palace until they came to the room of the Great Knife. Invisible Trot followed soberly after them, still wondering what she could do to save her friend. As soon as they entered the room of the Great Knife, the Boorloo gave a yell of disappointment. "What's become of Tiggle?" he shouted. "Where's Tiggle? Who has released Tiggle? Go at once, you dummies, and find him, or it will go hard with you." The frightened soldiers hurried away to find Tiggle, and Trot was well pleased because she knew Tiggle was by this time safely hidden. The Boorloo stamped up and down the room, muttering threats and declaring Cap'n Bill should be patched whether Tiggle was found or not. And while they waited, Trot took time to make an inspection of the place, which she now saw for the first time in broad daylight. The room of the Great Knife was high and big, and around it ran rows of benches for the spectators to sit upon. In one place, at the head of the room, was a raised platform for the royal family, with elegant throne chairs for the King and Queen and 6 smaller but richly upholstered chairs for the snub-nosed princesses. The poor Queen, by the way, was seldom seen, as she passed all her time playing solitaire with a deck that was 1 card short, hoping that before she had lived her entire 600 years she would win the game. Therefore Her Majesty paid no attention to anyone, and no one paid any attention to her. In the center of the room stood the terrible knife that gave the place its name, a name dreaded by every inhabitant of the Blue City. The knife was built into a huge framework like a derrick that reached to the ceiling, and it was so arranged that when the Bolaroo pulled a cord the great blade would drop down in its frame and neatly cut in two the person who stood under it. And in order that the slicing would be accurate, there was another frame to which the prisoner was tied, so that he couldn't wiggle either way. This frame was on rollers, so that it could be placed directly underneath the knife. While Trot was observing this dreadful machine, the door opened and in walked the 6 snub-nosed princesses, all in a row and with their chins up, as if they disdained everyone but themselves. They were magnificently dressed, and their blue hair was carefully arranged in huge towers upon their heads, with blue plumes stuck into the tops. These plumes waved gracefully in the air with every mincing step the princesses took. Rich jewels of blue stones glittered upon their persons, and the royal ladies were fully as gorgeous as they were haughty and overbearing. They marched to the chairs and seated themselves to enjoy the cruel scene their father was about to enact, and Cap'n Bill bowed to them politely and said: "Mornin', girls. Hope ye feel as well as ye look." "Papa," exclaimed Turquoise angrily, "can you not prevent this vile earth being from addressing us? It is an insult to be spoken to by one about to be patched." "Control yourselves, my dear," replied the Bolaroo. "The worst punishment I know how to inflict on anyone this prisoner is about to suffer. You'll see a very pretty patching, my royal daughters." "When?" inquired Cobalt. "When? As soon as the soldiers return with Tiggle," said he. But just then in came the soldiers to say that Tiggle could not be found anywhere in the city. He had disappeared as mysteriously as had Ghip Ghisizzle. Immediately the Bolaroo flew into another towering rage. "Villains!" he shouted. "Go out and arrest the first living thing you meet, and whoever it proves to be will be instantly patched to Cap'n Bill." The captain of the guards hesitated to obey this order. "Suppose it's a friend?" he suggested. "Friend!" roared the Bolaroo. "I haven't a friend in the country. Tell me, sir, do you know of anyone who is my friend?" The captain shook his head. "I can't think of anyone just now, your spry and flighty high and mighty Majesty," he answered. "Of course not," said the Bolaroo. "Everyone hates me, and I don't object to that because I hate everybody. But I'm the ruler here, and I'll do as I please. Go and capture the first living thing you see, and bring him here to be patched to Cap'n Bill." So the Captain took a file of soldiers and went away very sorrowful, for he did not know who would be the victim, and if the Bolaroo had no friends the Captain had plenty, and did not wish to see them patched. Meantime, Trot, being invisible to all, was roaming around the room, and behind a bench she found a small coil of rope which she picked up. Then she seated herself in an out-of-the-way place and quietly waited. Suddenly there was a noise in the corridor, and evidence of scuffling and struggling. Then the door flew open, and in came the soldiers, dragging a great blue billy goat which was desperately striving to get free. "Villains!" howled the Bolaroo. "What does this mean?" "Why, you said to fetch the first living creature we met, and that was this billy goat," replied the Captain, panting hard as he held fast to one of the goat's horns. The Bolaroo stared a moment, and then he fell back in his throne, laughing boisterously. The idea of patching Cap'n Bill to a goat was vastly amusing to him, and the more he thought of it, the more he roared with laughter. Some of the soldiers laughed, too, being tickled with the absurd notion, and the 6 snub-nosed princesses all sat up straight and permitted themselves to smile contemptuously. This would indeed be a severe punishment. Therefore the princesses were pleased at the thought of Cap'n Bill's becoming half a billy goat, and the billy goat's being half Cap'n Bill. "They look something alike, you know," suggested the captain of the guards, looking from one to the other doubtfully, "and they're nearly the same size if you stand the goat on his hind legs. They've both got the same style of whiskers, and they're both of 'em obstinate and dangerous, so they ought to make a good patch." "Splendid! Fine! Glorious!" cried the Bolaroo, wiping the tears of merriment from his eyes. "We will proceed with the ceremony of patching at once." Cap'n Bill regarded the billy goat with distinct disfavor, and the billy goat glared evilly upon Cap'n Bill. Trot was horrified and wrung her little hands in sore perplexity, for this was a most horrible fate that awaited her dear old friend. "First bind the earth man in the frame," commanded the Bolaroo. "We'll slice him in two before we do the same to the billy goat." So they seized Cap'n Bill and tied him into the frame so that he couldn't move a jot in any direction. Then they rolled the frame underneath the great knife and handed the Bolaroo the cord that released the blade. But while this was going on, Trot had crept up and fastened one end of her rope to the frame in which Cap'n Bill was confined. Then she stood back and watched the Bolaroo, and just as he pulled the cord she pulled on her rope and dragged the frame on its rollers away, so that the great knife fell with a crash and sliced nothing but the air. "Huh?" exclaimed the Bolaroo. "That's queer. Roll him up again, soldiers." The soldiers again rolled the frame in position, having first pulled the great knife once more to the top of the derrick. The immense blade was so heavy that it took the strength of 7 Blueskins to raise it. When all was in readiness, the King pulled the cord a second time, and Trot at the same instant pulled upon her rope. The same thing happened as before. Cap'n Bill rolled away in his frame, and the knife fell harmlessly. Now, indeed, the Bolaroo was as angry as he was amazed. He jumped down from the platform and commanded the soldiers to raise the great knife into position. When this had been accomplished, the Bolaroo leaned over to try to discover why the frame rolled away, seemingly of its own accord, and he was the more puzzled because it had never done such a thing before. As he stood, bent nearly double, his back was toward the billy goat, which, in their interest and excitement, the soldiers were holding in a careless manner. At once the goat gave a leap, escaped from the soldiers, and with bowed head rushed upon the Bolaroo. Before any could stop him, he butted His Majesty so furiously that the King soared far into the air and tumbled in a heap among the benches, where he lay moaning and groaning. The goat's warlike spirit was aroused by this successful attack. Finding himself free, he turned and assaulted the soldiers, butting them so fiercely that they tumbled down in bunches, and as soon as they could rise again ran frantically from the room and along the corridors as if a fiend was after them. By this time the goat was so animated by the spirit of conquest that he rushed at the 6 snub-nosed princesses, who had all climbed upon their chairs and were screaming in a panic of fear. 6 times the goat butted, and each time he tipped over a chair and sent a haughty princess groveling upon the floor, where the ladies got mixed up in their long blue trains and flounces and laces, and struggled wildly until they recovered their footing. Then they sped in great haste for the door, and the goat gave a final butt that sent the row of royal ladies all diving into the corridor in another tangle, whereupon they shrieked in a manner that terrified everyone within sound of their voices. As the room of the great knife was now cleared of all but Cap'n Bill, who was tied in his frame, and of Trot and the moaning Bolaroo, who lay hidden behind the benches, the goat gave a victorious bleat and stood in the doorway to face any enemy that might appear. Trot had been as surprised as anyone at this sudden change of conditions, but she was quick to take advantage of the opportunities it afforded. First she ran with her rope to the goat, and as the animal could not see her, she easily succeeded in tying the rope around its horns and fastening the loose end to a pillar of the doorway. Next she hurried to Cap'n Bill and began to unbind him. As she touched the sailor she became visible. He nodded cheerfully then and said, "I had a notion it was you, mate, as saved me from the knife. But it were a pretty close call, and I hope it won't happen again. I couldn't shiver much, being bound so tight, but when I'm loose I mean to have just one good shiver to relieve my feelin's." "Shiver all you want to, Cap'n," she said as she removed the last bonds. "But first you've got to help me save us both." "As how?" he asked, stepping from the frame. "Come and get the Bolaroo," she said, going toward the benches. The sailor followed and pulled out the Bolaroo, who, when he saw the terrible goat was captured and tied fast, quickly recovered his courage. "Hi there!" he cried. "Where are my soldiers? What do you mean, prisoner, by daring to lay hands upon me? Let me go this minute, or I'll have you patched twice." "Don't mind him, Cap'n," said Trot, "but fetch him along to the frame." The Bolaroo looked around to see where the voice came from, and Cap'n Bill grinned joyfully and caught up the King in both his strong arms, dragging the struggling monarch of the Blues to the frame. "Stop it! How dare you?" roared the frightened Bolaroo. "I'll have revenge! I'll " "You'll take it easy, 'cause you can't help yourself," said Cap'n Bill. "What's next, Queen Trot?" "Hold him steady in the frame and I'll tie him up," she replied. So Cap'n Bill held the Bolaroo, and the girl tied him fast in position, as Cap'n Bill had been tied, so that his Majesty couldn't wiggle at all. Then they rolled the frame in position underneath the great knife, and Trot held in her hand the cord which would release it. "All right, Cap'n," she said in a satisfied tone. "I guess we can run this blue country ourselves, after this." The Bolaroo was terrified to find himself in danger of being sliced by the same knife he had so often wickedly employed to slice others. Like Cap'n Bill, he had no room to shiver, but he groaned very dismally and was so full of fear that his blue hair nearly stood on end. End of chapter 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sky Island by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 25. The Ruler of Sky Island. The girl now took off Rosalie's ring and put it carefully away in her pocket. "It won't matter who sees me now," she remarked, "and I want 'em to know that you and me, Cap'n, are running this kingdom. I'm Queen o' the Pinkies and Bullaroo o' the Blues, and " "What's that?" asked the sailor. "You're what, Trot?" "Bullaroo. Isn't that right, Cap'n?" "I don't know, mate. It sounds bigger'n you are, and I don't like the word, anyhow." "Suppose you just call yourself the Boss. That fits the bill and don't need pronouncin'." "All right," she said. "Queen o' the Pinkies and Boss o' the Blues. Seems funny, don't it, Cap'n Bill?" Just then they heard a sound of footsteps in the corridor. The soldiers had partly recovered their courage, and fearful of the anger of their dreaded Bolaroo, whom the princesses declared would punish them severely, had ventured to return to the room. They came rather haltingly, though, and the captain of the guards first put his head cautiously through the doorway to see if the coast was clear. The goat discovered him and tried to make a rush, but the rope held the animal back, and when the captain saw this he came forward more boldly. "Halt!" cried Trot. The captain halted, his soldiers peering curiously over his shoulders, and the 6 snub-nosed princesses looking on from behind, where they considered themselves safe. "If anyone dares enter this room without my permission," said Trot, "I'll pull this cord and slice your master that once was the Bolaroo." "Don't come in! Don't come in!" yelled the Bolaroo in a terrified voice. Then they saw that the sailor was free and the Bolaroo bound in his place. The soldiers were secretly glad to observe this, but the princesses were highly indignant. "Release his Majesty at once!" cried Indigo from the corridor. "You shall be severely punished for this rebellion." "Don't worry," replied Trot. "His Majesty isn't His Majesty any longer. He's just a common Blueskin. Cap'n Bill and I propose runnin' this island ourselves after this. You've got to obey me, for I'm the no, I mean the Boss o' the Blues, and I've a notion to run things my own way." "You can't," said Turquoise scornfully. "The law says—" "Bother the law!" exclaimed Trot. "I'll make the laws myself from now on, and I'll unmake every law you ever had before I conquered you." "Oh! Have you conquered us, then?" asked the Captain of the Guards in a surprised tone. "Of course," said Trot. "Can't you see?" "It looks like it," admitted the Captain. "Cap'n Bill is going to be my General of the Army and the Royal Manager of the Blue Country," continued Trot, "so you'll mind what he says." "Nonsense!" shouted Indigo. "March in and capture them, Captain. Never mind if they do slice the Bolaroo. I'm his daughter, and I'll rule the kingdom." "You won't!" screamed Cobalt. "I'll rule it." "I'll rule it myself!" cried Cerulia. "No, no!" yelled Turquoise. "I'll be the ruler." "That shall be MY privilege!" shouted Sapphire. Cobalt began to say, "I'm the—" "Be quiet!" said Trot sternly. "Would you have your own father sliced so that you could rule in his place?" "Yes, yes, of course," rejoined the six princesses without a second's hesitation. "Well, well! What do you think o' that, Mr. Bolaroo?" asked Cap'n Bill. "They're undutiful daughters. Don't pay any attention to them," replied the frightened Bolaroo. "We're not goin' to," said Trot. "Now you, Blue Cap'n, who are you and your soldiers going to obey, me or the snub-nosed ones?" "You," declared the Captain of the Guards, positively, for he hated the princesses, as did all the Blueskins. "Then escort these girls to their rooms, lock 'em in, and put a guard before the door." At once the soldiers seized the princesses and, notwithstanding their snarls and struggles, marched them to their rooms and locked them in. While they were gone on this errand the Bolaroo begged to be released, whining and wailing for fear the knife would fall upon him. But Trot did not think it safe to unbind him just then. When the soldiers returned she told their leader to put a strong guard before the palace and to admit no one unless she or Cap'n Bill gave the order to do so. The soldiers obeyed readily, and when Trot and Cap'n Bill were left alone they turned the goat loose in the room of the Great Knife, and they locked the animal in with the Bolaroo. "The billy goat is the very best guard we could have, for everybody's 'fraid o' him," remarked Cap'n Bill as he put the key of the room in his pocket. "So now, Queen Trot, what's next on the program?" "Next," said Trot, "we're goin' to hunt for that umbrel, Cap'n. I don't mean to stay in this dismal blue country long, even if I am the Queen. Let's find the umbrel and get home as soon as we can." "That suits me!" the sailor joyfully exclaimed, and then the two began a careful search through the palace. They went into every room and looked behind the furniture and underneath the beds and in every crack and corner, but no place could they spy the Magic Umbrella. Cap'n Bill even ventured to enter the rooms of the six snub-nosed princesses, who were by this time so thoroughly alarmed that they had become meek and mild as could be. But the umbrella wasn't there, either. Finally they returned to the great throne room of the palace, where they seated themselves on the throne and tried to think what could possibly have become of the precious umbrella. While they were sitting and talking together, the Captain of the Guards entered and bowed respectfully. "Beg pardon, your small-sized Majesty," said he to Trot, "but it is my duty to report that the Pinkies are preparing to attack the city." "Oh, I'd forgotten the Pinkies!" exclaimed the girl. "Tell me, Captain, have you such a thing as a brass band in this city?" "We have two fine bands, but they're not brass," replied the Captain. "Their instruments are made of blue metal." "Well, order 'em out," commanded Trot. "And say, get all the soldiers together and tell all the people there's going to be a high time in the Blue City tonight. We'll have music and dancing and eating and—" "And neckties to drink, Trot. Don't forget the royal neckties," urged Cap'n Bill. "We'll have all the fun there is going," continued the girl, "for we are to entertain the army of the Pinkies." "The Pinkies!" exclaimed the Captain of the Guards. "Why, they're our enemies, your short highness." "Not any more," replied Trot. "I'm Queen of the Pinkies, and I'm also Queen of the Blues, so I won't have my people quarreling. Tell the blue people we are to throw open the gates and welcome the Pinkies to the city, where everybody will join in a grand celebration. And just as soon as you've spread the news and got the bands tuned up and the soldiers ready to march, you let us know and we'll head the procession." "Your microscopic Majesty shall be obeyed," said the Captain, and went away to carry out these commands. End of chapter 25.